Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Maura Susie Brown. I'm a Senior Technical Advisor with the USAID Medicines, Technologies, and Pharmaceutical Services Program, MTaPS. I'll be moderating this webinar titled Digitalizing Medicines Regulatory Systems, Defining Minimum Common Standards, a Small Step Towards a Big Leap. And this is presented on behalf of USAID MTaPS, as well as the USAID Promoting the Quality of Medicines Plus program, PQM Plus. Thank you for joining us this morning. We will start with an overview of the agenda and some sort of ground rules for how the webinar will be moderated. Can I see the next slide, please? So we are now in the welcome and introduction portion of our agenda. We will then get into a presentation after some opening remarks, and that will be followed by an audience question and answer session, and we will complete with some closings from both programs. Just as an introduction to the moderation, please use the chat function to ask questions and make comments. We do ask that you hold your questions until the question and answer session. If something really urgent and pressing comes up, feel free to use the chat. We will then take that question during the Q&A. And at that time, you can raise your hand as an audience member, as an attendee, to gain unmute and mute control for your microphone. So raise your hand, we will then call on you. You will have permission to unmute your microphone, and then we can start a dialogue that way. And I will refresh this once we get to that portion of our agenda. For now, I'd like to welcome Toby Bush of the Office of Global Health to get us started. Toby?
Great, thank you, Maura. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Toby Bush, and I'm a Senior Technical Advisor in the Office of Health Systems, and I'm representing the AOR team for the PQM Plus program and the COR team for the MTaPS program. So there is a group of wonderful women symbolically standing here behind me. On behalf of USAID's Office of Health Systems, we're proud and pleased to welcome you all here today for what I know will be an informative presentation and a lively discussion. Many, if not all of you, are familiar with the two programs, PQM Plus and MTaPS. Both programs are working to further USAID's vision for health system strengthening 2030, ensuring strong regulatory systems and the availability of quality, safe, effective, and affordable medical products in low and middle income countries. This webinar is the result of several years of work by both the MTaPS and PQM Plus programs to help build the capacity of national regulatory authorities and LMICs, and to equip NRAs with the tools to help facilitate their work. As you will hear in detail, MTaPS and PQM Plus collaborated with international, regional, and local stakeholders to establish minimum common standards upon which all regulatory information management systems can be based. By collaboratively devising a set of minimum common standards, national regulatory authorities will be able to prioritize and streamline their workflows, maintain documentation of regulatory processes, ensure information data capture, and enable data exchange within and between other national regulatory authorities and their stakeholders. Common standards will help ensure national regulatory authorities make decisions with consistency and transparency, and will enhance their ability to collaborate and share information. I don't want to take up any more of your time. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you both to PQM Plus and to MTaPS for the hard work that they have put into this activity. And I will turn it over to Kate. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby, and thanks, Maura. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And I'll just give you just a context in which we've been operating to develop these standards that Toby talked about. Our regulatory authorities, such as the one that you may be familiar with, the US FDA, promote access to and appropriate use of quality assured, safe and efficacious medicines, and also work to combat the circulation of substandard or falsified medical products on their markets. However, in low and middle income countries, the regulatory capacity is really limited, and it's insufficient with inefficient regulatory workflows and lack of transparency, and also vulnerability to corruption. So working to address those problems, the NMRAs have over the past decades worked to initiate digitalization of the regulatory processes to improve consistency, efficiency, and accountability in regulatory services, and to facilitate convergence and harmonization within and among the national medicines regulatory authorities. To contribute towards that effort, the two implementing partners, MTaPS and PQM+, worked with key stakeholders at regional, global, and country level to develop and to identify and develop a set of minimum common standards for regulatory information management systems. If we move on to the next slide, we look at some of the challenges that are currently being experienced in national regulatory authorities, and what we hope that these standards would address. In many low and middle income countries, the regulatory information management systems that support the key regulatory functions that are well spelled out in the WHO global benchmarking tool are disjointed or interoperable with the other systems within or among the countries. For example, you will find that perhaps the registration system is digitalized, whereas the other regulatory functions like licensing of establishments like pharmacies and manufacturers is paper-based. Even if all are digitalized, but they are not connected to each other. So in some cases, the digitalized regulatory information systems are non-functional or non-existent. And the other challenge that the national regulatory authorities face is that many regulatory processes are paper-based, leading to inefficient and inconsistent workflows and increased likelihood of human error in data management and backlogs and delays, a lack of transparency and vulnerability to corruption. All these lead to delays in registration of products and also control of the market. And also the other challenge relates to NRA struggling to fully operationalize both web and paper-based information management systems, which limit availability of real-time data. And then some countries are also working to address these challenges by digitalizing their processes, but the systems are not consistent with each other, and they're not interoperable. So because of this, it complicates the collaboration among regulatory authorities and exchange of information and data across the regulatory authorities. If we move on to the next slide. So given the challenges that we've discussed before, the two programs aimed at developing and recommending a set of minimum common standards for regulatory information management systems that would also facilitate the digitalization of the systems in the national regulatory authorities. The specific objectives related to identifying the critical gaps and challenges that the authorities face, and also deriving the recommended set of the minimum common standards, and developing the use case for the standards and promoting their adoption, and use in the process of digitalization of the regulatory information management systems. If we move on to the next slide. To give you an insight of what the programs undertook in the standard selection process, initially we performed a literature review to identify the potential standards that are available in the public space and what we knew. So here, MTaPS and PQM Plus performed several rounds of literature review by, identifying and articulating the challenges in consultation with representative, stakeholders, and collecting and organizing the standards according to the function. That's the regulatory functions are spelled out in the GBT and their particular unique characteristics. Following that process, we came up with 56 standards that were based on relevance and to the activity objectives and the scope of the regulatory information management systems. We did not consider any other standards that relate to other support functions like finance and HR and the like, but focus mainly on the key 8 regulatory functions. That's the internal processes which coincided with the process workflows and also standard dictionaries and knowledge trees and data exchange. This will be elaborated further down in the presentation. Following that, we also held virtual consultative meetings with global and regional regulatory and information management system experts and representatives from the national regulatory authorities to further define and validate the challenges, the use case for the standards, and these standards that were identified were circulated to the stakeholders for in-depth review and feedback based on the selection criteria that was presented to them. So in the concert, we present the different organizations that were represented, and this covered 17 organizations representing global organizations and also regional and continental organizations such as the AUDA and also global organizations like the Gates Foundation. And further on, we also included representatives from 14 national medicines regulatory authorities from Asia and Africa as listed. So after that whole process of consultation, we came up with the proposed minimum common standards, and this included 13 process standards and 13 data dictionaries and knowledge trees and 6 data exchange standards. And if we move further on, Suli can now talk further about the standards that were selected. Over to you, Suli. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And nice to be here as part of this webinar, or hopefully with the presentation that we'll be providing, provide some insights as well as some clarity to the importance and significance of the data standards that we are attempting to be adopted by the national regulatory authority as well as regional authority networks and at the global level. So if we look into the 3 different sets of data standards here that identify, you can see on the left-hand side, the process or the workflow standards that apply to pharmaceuticals in terms of procedures, process, and the workflow itself. So what we mean by that, these include not only the internationally acceptable process that help the countries NMIAs to achieve the next maturity level, for example, maturity level 3 and 4. And this is related to not only the specific country regulatory functions, but it covers also the WHO global benchmarking tool of 9 regulatory functions. The example that we can point out here, and we can go on the next slide further, good practices such as good manufacturing practices, the GMP. That's outline all the requirements for building the process within the manufacturing by the manufacturers. And from the regulator's perspective is that how the regulatory framework that pertain to make sure that manufacturers produce the product that meet quality, safe, and efficacious parameters are part of this regulatory requirement under this practice. So in this category, we had identified 15 standards, but 13 have been selected for recommendation to the NMIAs to adopt. The second category is pharmaceutical standards dictionary and knowledge 3. This is very important to help not only harmonization, regulatory conversions, in terms of using the same terminology wherever we're referring to, in terms of the product, the substance, the finished product, etc. So the nomenclature, that's also another thing that need to be unified before you can communicate, exchange the regulatory activity information. The hierarchies of these standards as well, it's very important. For example, at the usual, ordinary, how you communicate, how you make the information understood by your colleague, for example. And the second level is how the management will interpret that information to help them to make the decision in such a way that, oh, my regulatory authority is at this level, maturity level 3, for example, how the information that can be communicated to the partners of the same level, for example. So that's the next level of hierarchies. And the top level would be the CEO of the NMIA or the DG of NMIA, how to make the decision based on the information provided in this hierarchical structure, right? So the example we have is anatomic therapeutic chemical, right? The ATC. And usually from the ICH perspective and other advanced regulatory authority, they go even further to add DDDs that define daily dose of the substance and the product itself. So usually we refer to ATC DDD to determine the prescription that in line with each of the substances in terms of dosing, regimen, etc. And of course, the international non-proprietary names, that's usually in the lay language, we say generic name, right? For the chemicals that we have in the global market. If the INN is identified, then all the chemical pertinent that particular product will be known at the same unique number that reflects to that name, right? And with this category, we have 21 standard identified, and only 13 have been selected based on, of course, the adaptability and feasibility to implement the data standards at the NMIA in the low and middle income countries. On the right-hand side, you can see the data exchange standard. This is another set of data standard that pertain the information and communication technology in the context of digitalization or implementing the regulatory information system with submission, for example, electronically from the manufacturers or applicants to the regulators. Regulator will review using that platform, the same technology that compatible between manufacturers, applicants, and also the regulators. So the two end of the bridge has to build at the same time, rather than build one from the regulator perspective, but drop out the manufacturers that do not have the same capacity, same language in the IT system, then they will have a problem there. Build a bridge from both ends to match the same technology on the information management system, right? So the example is common technical dossier here, or common technical document, in the other words. Many countries that we have experienced so far, they have their own national format for submitting or compiling the dossier. However, with the CTD that came about 1934-35, and it's still evolving in terms of the format, adding more complexity into it, but simplify in terms of once you start the CTD format, you will be able to save in the long term your time, your process becoming more efficient and effective because you use the same format. And also the majority of the NMIA that receive the application, they would prefer now, I would say more than 80% prefer the CTD format in the dossier submission for them to approve or reject a certain product for registration or approval. Now the platforms such as the fast healthcare interoperability resource that's also facilitate terminology, the language that we wouldn't, see, for example, between clinicians and pharmacists and the prescribers and the regulator, for example. Those are the kind of common standards that should be considered to implement. And among these starts under the data exchange, we identify 20, but the selection is 6 for the low and middle income country to consider. If you can go to the next slide, these are the complete list of the minimum common standards that are selected and recommend to the NMIAs in low and middle income country. So I don't want to run through each of these standards, but you can see, for example, the very basic one, good laboratory practice, that's applied for all the laboratory that analyze or test the pharmaceutical product, for example. This also apply for clinical laboratory. This also apply to calibrating laboratory, etc. So, and the monograph is a recipe for testing of a particular product, substance as well as finished product. And you can see the rest, for example, the ICH Q10 on the second from the bottom. These pertain the pharmaceutical quality system based on the product life cycle that need to be in place, right? So the second column, you can see data dictionary. The basic one is already discussed, INN, for example, ATC, etc. And each of the aspect of the activity from the regulatory standpoint, we have the standard to be considered by the regulatory authority so that at least you can start with something with respect to say, quality, safety, efficacy, pharmacovigilance, etc. So these are the basic ones that each of the regulatory authorities should consider. And the last is the data exchange. We already discussed about that. The E2B, for example, on the pharmacovigilance, that has to have the the standard that's applied to it. Otherwise, you will not be able, for example, defining the specific causality that evaluated by the committee of the country and communicate that to the WHO Drug Quality Safety Monitoring Center, Uppsala, for example. So that's built in under the VC flow, leases as well, so that the same communication information is transmitted to the respective authority and the center. And the next slide, please. So looking from the benefit standpoint for adopting the data standards here, you can see we hope that the NMIA would understand the importance and significance of adopting these minimum common standards, because it aligns the regulatory process in the context of the global benchmarking, for example. That's also another aspect to consider looking forward, specifically when you achieve maturity level 3 and maturity level 4. You will have a specific sub-indicators in the IDP that require be in place before you can move to the next level. And also the adoption of these promote the harmonization, interoperability, as Kate mentioned earlier. Interoperability here is not only within the regulatory authority, but also between the networks as well. And if you would like to go beyond that, then you need to think of, my system is communicating the same language with yours or not. So that's the basic thing that we need to look into it, right? So consistency, needless to say, this is one of the top, I would say, that attract my, close to my heart very much, because we have been interacting with so many dozens of regulatory authority that are not inconsistent in terms of the data exchange from the regulatory perspective, right? If we talk about, say, ethylene glycol or de-ethylene glycol, for example, if you use one term where the others do not use, for example, the universal uniqueness of that substance, it may confuse with, say, glycerin, for example, which is not toxic, right? Why the ethylene glycol? The ethylene glycol is fatal substance. So we have to keep this in mind in terms of making sure the information is consistent in line with the international acceptable standards. Streamlining the process, I already mentioned about that, and also facilitating the conversions of regulatory services. I think before we can have a, say, sub-regional or regional harmonization, making sure that we are talking using the same data standard to communicate with each other. That's the first step, among the first step. After that you will have to design the digitalization apparatus that consists of the features, functionality that can transmit among themselves the network, so that they have the same platform for that communication. And of course, without that converging, we get just talking, but without this kind of technology and the data standard that communicate with each other, then that will not be possible. And increase, of course, the harmonization is already mentioned about this. Hopefully, this will be one of the consideration at the regional level, specifically in the context of AMA, for example, right? For ASEAN, for example, and international for regulatory authorities, forum, etc. So next slide, please. So the next step here at the global and regional level, we hope to be able to hone up on the regulatory authority and their networks to recognize and start to adopt the identified set of minimum standards that we present to you. So, and we are available to provide assistance step by step for those of the countries that are attempting or have been already trying to implement or incorporating the data standard in their information management system. And the two programs, MTaPS and PQM Plus, would be able to also support in collaboration with WHO as well. Have the guidelines already available, and Kate will present later in stepwise process in terms of adopting the data standard that we present. And of course, ODA, NEPAD, and ASEAN will engage throughout the consultative process, and many of the members among these two networks expressed interest, and a few of them already came forward and have conversation at the personal level when this data standard would be launched and officially disseminate to the different countries and the regions. So hopefully we'll be able to work closely with WHO also. Each of the interest party or coalition of interest parties, meeting, then we will be engaged. For example, tomorrow it will be already the steering committee of the global CIP network, right? And plus MTaPS among the participants, and socializing and sensitizing with the regulatory authority for their needs of support, and we will be able, depending, of course, the resource availability, especially the funding, either from the USAID or from other sources, and we are there to provide support. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Suli. And we have and PQM Plus have prepared several reference key resources that will enable you to understand and provide information on the standards, and also offer guidances for the for the countries to adopt these standards. And the first one is a call to action to adopt the minimum common standards for regulatory information management systems. And it provides an oversight of the context of the regulation in low and middle income countries, the justification for of these standards, and obstacles that may impede the adoption of these standards, and calling on to stakeholders at the global level for development partners and donors to invest in this area, as well as promoting convergence of regulation at the regional economic communities, and also for at the national level for regulators and policymakers and funders and implementers to guide them on the process of adopting the standards and using these standards in their processes. Next slide. The other resource is a reference for national regulatory authorities to guide them on the pathway to digitalize their regulatory information management systems. And this one provides an overview of implementing digitalization of the regulatory functions, and provides what needs to be in place in order for the regulatory authorities to digitalize their processes. Next slide. The last resource is a report on the consultative process, and it provides an in-depth information of how we went about, selecting the standards and reviewing the selection process and the criteria that was used, and giving really an overview of the whole consultative process and the meeting reports that were generated after those exercises. Next slide. So the question is, what can USAID do to promote further progress in implementation and adoption of these standards? So given the references that have been produced by MTaPS and PQM Plus, they serve as tools for USAID to use to advocate for adoption of these standards and promote further strengthening of the national regulatory systems in the countries of interest and through the various programs that are implemented by the missions. So specifically, it looks at, we recommend, maybe we urge USAID to incorporate the standard, to support incorporation of the standards in the national regulatory support activities, and also to invest in supporting the national regulatory authorities to digitalize their processes according to the recommended pathway, and also to leverage the advocacy brief to tailor messages to national counterparts. So the ultimate call is really to urge to continue to invest in regulatory system strengthening as part of the broader pharmaceutical system strengthening goal to promote access to an appropriate use of quality assured, safe, and efficacious medicines and combat the circulation of falsified medical products on the market. In the end goal really is to improve treatment outcomes as part of the health delivery services, and also to improve the quality of lives of the people that we serve. So thank you. Maybe if we move on to the next slide. So thank you very much for your attention, and hand it over back to Maura.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Suli. Thank you, audience members, for your attention. I see we have a couple of questions from the chat. So just to get us started, I'm going to kick right off there. I see a question from Jane pertaining to the GS1 standards pertaining to supply chain security. So for example, track and trace to ensure that substandard products do not enter the supply chain. I think that this was actually addressed by the following slide. We did include the GS1 standards under data dictionaries and knowledge trees. If you're looking for more detail about that, I do encourage you to take a look at some of the reports that we prepared just in terms of the selection criteria. I will note that it is going to be of vital importance and high relevance. However, feasibility is ranked relatively low just because of the resource intensiveness of implementing those standards. So that's why it's listed low, but it is included in the minimum common set of standards that we are recommending. Moving down, we had another question about the process standards. I'll read this one and direct this to Kate. The process standards mainly or entirely seem to be not necessarily standards that NRAs use or follow themselves, but which other stakeholders, for example, manufacturers, warehouses, etc., follow, and which perhaps NRAs must supervise the use of. So for example, medicine registration, there is not a process standard, but for manufacturing there is. Can you speak to that?
Thanks for that question. Yeah, it is true that the process standards, like, for example, good manufacturing practices, is implemented by the manufacturers. However, the regulatory authorities have to have a system to assess the compliance to the good manufacturing process standard. And so these are prerequisites, like in the regulatory space, you have to ensure that you have a clearly documented standard that you'll be following to assure, to assess the compliance. So you have the, like for GMP, you have the USFDA GMP standard. You have the European Medicines Agency standard. You have, WHO has also specified the GMP standard. So the National Regulatory Authority has to have a reference standard to follow in order to assess compliance. So that's how, like, they have to know, they have to specify which standard they are following. And for example, also like the quality management system standard, this one is also implemented it's implemented in the regulatory authority. And like the QMS standard can be implemented in any company or organization. And for the regulatory authority, it has to be implemented and is part of the requirement of the WHO GBT. So that's how, you know, we have framed that. It's not that they implement like PMP in the regulatory authority, but they assess compliance to that standard and they have to have a reference. Over.
Maybe
Oh, go ahead, Suli.
yeah, just would like to add one aspect. Looking from the low and middle income countries, right? The inspectorate has the mandate to inspect the GMP compliant perspective. And to do so, they have to have the rule of law defining the framework pertinent the GMP standards that would apply for specific markets where the product will intend to be marketed and used, right? So if you refer to international, that would be WHO GMP. You look into the stringent authority markets, you look into ICH, right? So they have also national GMP standards that in line with the legal framework of the regulators. So without the role of the regulators to enforce that, then GMP standards just a standards. So I think it's not the solely responsibility of the manufacturers to apply this. The regulators has even the critical role to make sure that the quality of the product is built in the manufacturing. That is the GMP to start with. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate and Suli. I see we have a raised hand from the attendees. Before we that person to ask their question, I just have a request to all the attendees. If you can please type your full name, your title or organization, and your location in the chat just for our record keeping purposes, that would be wonderful. And also just as a reminder to everyone, if you would like to unmute to ask a question, please raise your hand and we will get to you in turn. So over to Al from JSI Ethiopia.
Thank you, everybody. I believe you can hear me. So congratulations, everybody, for really excellent work that's been done. I very much wish that this has been done much earlier for various countries to take advantage of. So just have a couple of comments. I think the standards are pretty comprehensive, and you know that standards are evolving. So it's going to take a lot of effort to maintain this. So I hope that's also going to be part of the process from your end. If you're not able to necessarily maintain that beginning of the process, but hopefully build a capacity within the country to be able to maintain this as well, and hopefully share it across countries. Secondly, I do like the process map that was suggested on the previous slide. That's also very excellent. But one thing I very much want to mention, I think is quite important, is, and by the way, I really wish Ethiopia was included in the review. I see there are 14 countries, but is that it's digitization is a process. So I think it's very key that we communicate to the countries that they don't go into the belief that if they don't get all the processes, that they cannot start. I think that assumption could be hurting because most countries are in different stages of maturity. So I think we gotta be able to stress that. And I just want to make that comment. Over.
Thank you, Al. Just as a quick aside, I would encourage you to take a look at that pathway document. What we've tried to do is account for the spectrum of maturity levels of these systems so that, you know, if they start at the beginning, we have the low-hanging fruit at the beginning of the process. And as they mature, they can start implementing and adopting some of these more advanced standards, just as a helpful sort of guide to implement that. Is there any other questions from the attendees? Any other comments?
Laura, may I add reflects to the previous comment? Thank you. In the adoption guidance document, if I recall correctly, we encourage the country before even start to adopt any of the common standards minimally that we recommend. They should know where they are, right? And which standard they already have in place, and learning from that standard that they use, then they move to the next level. At the end, they need to prioritize also which one is the most critical one that my authority take on, right? Adding 1, 2, 3, next year, 1, 2, 3, going forward, such gradual, or how should I say, incremental way, right? Adopting it, and you learn as you do it. I think this is something, and the best way to do, based on our experience and a few, is you have to have the reliance, some sort of the more mature regulatory authority, what they have. For example, they introduce out of the 13, they introduce 7 at that level. And my authority has only 5, for example. How I can get that 7 and 8? What are the requirements? Doing that kind of evaluation will help, incrementally to move to the next step. Thank you.
Perfect. I think we have time for one more question before we move into our closing remarks. Anyone from the chat? Okay, then I'll direct a final question to Kate. Kate, can you speak more to the importance of global and regional regulatory harmonization efforts and how adoption of the standards can support these initiatives?
Well, thanks, Maura. We have several initiatives that are being implemented on the African and Asian continent. They're like on the African continent, we have the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization Initiative. And in Asia, we have several networks like the ASEAN Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and also the Southeast Regulatory Network. So within these networks, the various member countries are coming together to harmonize their regulatory systems. And we've been working in collaboration, we've been collaborating with these networks. So the question is, how can these standards be adopted by these networks? Yes, there's already an opportunity because there's a platform that brings together all these national regulatory authorities. So they can, first of all, move a policy to adopt the standards as they've been recommended by the programs, and then implement them within the member states. And in that way, if they set up the digitalized systems, they will be able to communicate with each other, exchange information across the region in a more, smooth and effective manner, as opposed to the current situations whereby right now, some of the countries have digitalized solutions, others are paper-based. And so in that process, it will be easy for them to generate data that will be used for effective making, in terms of the quality, looking at the quality of the product, and also, say, for pharmacovigilance, like identifying, any signals that may arise from the data that will be generated from the reports that have been submitted. So in that way, it will facilitate smoother and effective regional and regulatory decision-making that would enable, the appropriate control of these products in the specified region. Over.
Thank you, Kate. And on that note, I'd like to turn it over to Beth Yeager, the Deputy Program Director for the PQM Plus program, to deliver our first set of closing remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Mara, and thanks to everybody today. I am here representing Jude, who is at the CIP Steering Committee meeting that Sully mentioned in his presentation. Very honored to close out this session on this tremendously important work. As Sully mentioned, all of this will allow regulatory authorities to streamline their functions, making them more efficient and effective, and helping them in their journey towards a greater maturity level. But also, as again, Sully and Kate have just mentioned, also assisting with harmonization and reliance and convergence and all of these concepts that we've been talking about for years, but have not really been implemented as much as we would like to see happen. And so very much looking forward to seeing how these standards are adopted and to seeing what happens next. I'd like to thank all of our team and the MTaPS team that worked so hard, putting so many hours, as someone mentioned earlier. I can't remember if it was Toby or who. This has been a long time in coming. Very happy to see it come to the state it's at now. Very much like to thank our MTaPS team for being wonderful collaborators. We often say they are our sister program, brother program, whatever. We're siblings, and I think this is a wonderful example of really fruitful, productive collaboration. So thank you very much. And again, thank you to USAID for having the vision to support this activity. We share Toby and Lisa as part of our management team. We have separate, COR and AOR, but without them prodding and poking and providing the funding to advance this activity, we wouldn't have gotten this far. So again, thanks to everyone, and PQM Plus is very much looking forward to being a part of adoption of these standards moving forward. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. And on behalf of the MTaPS program, Kofi Nyame is going to deliver our second set of closing remarks.
Thank you, Maura. I want to thank everybody, especially those who have put in a lot of effort to get this here, and for our participants for spending this time with us to go through this webinar. I think that as USAID and as implementing partners, one of the main goals of our program is to improve access to high quality, safe and effective medical products. And we have to do that through strengthening the pharmaceutical regulatory systems. We cannot have the medicines there without a good and a strong regulatory system. And our regulatory systems can only work well if we give them the capacity to do that. We know that most of our NMRs have a lot of challenges navigating all these barriers that they have to work through, especially working with paper-based systems. I've seen regulators with boxes of dossiers that they have to go through. So really digitizing regulatory systems for medicines and for vaccines would improve operations in terms of consistency, efficiency, and accountability. And we all need to support this effort to move away from paper-based systems, but we need to do it in a collaborative manner so that the NMRA dealing with products and the pharmacy councils dealing with the persons and the premises can talk to each other, you speaking the same language, and the standards are being the same, so that the NMRAs in different countries and the regions can also talk to each other. Ensuring this interoperability and compatibility is what will move us towards the place where we have regulatory systems that are strong to support local manufacturing, that are strong to support the pharmacovigilance systems that we need to ensure patient safety, that are strong to ensure that the medicines that we are providing to our countries are used appropriately and are of the right quality. I really want to thank USAID for supporting this effort, and I look forward to more and more investments in this space so that we strengthen the totality of the pharmaceutical system, be it governance, be it supply chain, be it regulatory systems. That way, we would have the benefit of better health outcomes from a strengthened system. Thank you. We also want to thank our partners, our brothers and sisters, PQM Plus, who've been working well together, and thank our COR and AOR teams, and also the teams that have been funding this work in the field and will continue to fund it as we roll out and implement. Look forward to working with you all. Thank you all.
Thank you, Kofi. And on the next slide here, we just have a quick QR code that you can scan with your smartphones that will take you to the landing page for all the publications that we discussed. So I'll just pause here for a second to give people a chance to grab that. And I will bring us to a close just by again thanking our partner program, PQM Plus, and also our contacts at USAID. If you have any additional questions about this activity or about the programs, please reach out to the contacts here for each of the programs. And thank you so much for joining us today.